Hello, it's me and Ben, and we're going to be talking about philosophy, specifically AIs. But first, we're going to talk about the Iraq War, which Ben dedicates a surprisingly large amount of this article to at the beginning. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I had just when I wrote it, I actually the last thing I wrote before it was something for Jacobin on the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War. People can check it out there. It's called the
not a mistake, a crime.
Yes, exactly. And I had kind of been been telling. I think actually the night I wrote the Jacobin article, my neighbor and our mutual friend Jason Miles that I actually kind of surprised myself by just how viscerally pissed off I felt while I was writing that article. Like some of that definitely spilled over into the beginning of this because what I'm writing about in this week's essay on the Substack, Chomsky on ChatGPT, our machine learning systems like concentration camp guards, was, of course, the op-ed that Noam Chomsky and his co-authors just wrote for the New York Times about the cognitive limitations of ChatGPT, which we're about to get into in a minute. But what I found the sort of coincidence of that op-ed coming not very long before the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq pretty striking because, man, the New York Times couldn't have invited him to write about that, right? I mean, either at the time when he was leading critic of the planned invasion, or even now, right? Even for the 20th anniversary. Nope. He's
Did you see that the New York Times repeated a lie they said about Saddam in 2023 after they said it in 2003, but then were forced to correct it in 2003. But now in 2023, they've just said the original lie again.
Which one is this?
That he expelled the UN.
Expelled weapons inspectors. Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, I actually saw that Bret Stephens, who's a New York Times columnist, he's sort of a, Republican, not like a Trump guy, but the kind of Republican you could take to a dinner party with New York Times people. But he just wrote a column called "I Don't Regret My Support for the War in Iraq" or something like that, where I saw my friend Rob Larson pointed this out on social media that Stephens, without a scintilla of shame, brings up the Iran-Iraq War as evidence for what a threat Saddam was and why it was so important that he be taken out, without mentioning, what the United States was doing while that was happening.
Well, also, surely he supports invading Iran. Or did
yeah, surely, right?
Well, in 2003, Ben, I did support the invasion of Iraq. And my frustration at the time was that British troops weren't advancing far enough because American troops kind of swept the country while British troops advanced just to Basra. But in my defense, I turned 8 years old in the early days of the war.
We'll give you a pass on that one.
That is my first political memory, is specifically the frustration of British troops not advancing past Basra, which is a funny story.
That is funny. Yeah, well, I think that people who are closer to Bret Stephens' age than yours, should have that held against them a bit more. What their views were in 2000.
Yeah, rather the people who lied to me as a small child.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. I probably would have supported it regardless of what I was told. But anyway, we are going to be discussing something which also repeats everything you tell it, which is ChatGPT.
Yes.
I wanted to start by complaining about the Phil Paper server and the results constructed by my fellow philosophers' responses, where if you scroll down to the question, other minds, for which groups are some members conscious? Well, Funnily enough, first off, only 95% say yes to for humans.
Awesome.
So, and that obviously like that includes the person answering the question. So
Yeah.
if we're worried about kind of, maybe we should be questioning whether anything has a mind at all, which I guess is kind of
Which is,
almost almost what Dennett suggests or something like
although
this.
honestly, I kind of love that. I kind of love that part of the result. It's like, it's why I think it's hilarious when I've seen like people, I don't know, some Twitter argument that I didn't have a lot of context for. So I'm not, taking a side in this, but it was like had something to do with like trans issues and gender. And I saw somebody saying like the consensus among philosophers, like philosophers don't do consensus. What the hell are you talking about? They have you can't, like you literally can't get 100% for, do you personally have a mind?
um, the great one, which I think I pointed out to you before, is that more philosophers think that abortion is permissible than the percentage of philosophers who are non-skeptical realists about the external world. And what the fuck does it mean to have an abortion if like absolute idealism is true?
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's just hypothetically if a physical world did exist
Did
and,
exist, that
and
would
there were
be.
fetuses in it, and, yeah.
But okay, like
That is an
95% for
intensely held
humans,
position.
89% for cats, which very, very, very high. Then 65% for fish,
Uh,
and then 34% for flies. Flies. And then okay, so then it says current AI systems, and it's only 3%, which is fair enough. Also, this was taken before ChatGPT,
right.
where in 2019, 2020, when none of this has happened. But for the question, and this is I find outrageous, the question
Yeah.
for could any future AI system be conscious or have a mind? Only 39% said yes. So people are nearly close to thinking that that flies are more conscious or more likely to be conscious than any future possible AI system.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you think flies are conscious?
No. Though, I
Okay.
mean, it is one of the things you kind of talk about for a
Yeah.
while in the article is thinking and
Yeah.
consciousness.
Yeah.
And I think these are generally, especially thinking,
Uh,
is like a hopelessly underdefined word. And it's like, well, what do you mean? Like, definitely flies don't reprocess information in some kind of conscious way. They certainly aren't
yeah.
self-conscious. But what does it mean to be conscious if you don't consciously process information?
Yeah, I think it's not. I mean, look, I'm not going to pretend that I've spent a lot of time thinking about fly consciousness. So um, this is a hot take after 3 seconds of thought, But like, I guess I don't find it wildly out of the question. I mean, I am not like, I think if somebody, I don't know, voice of God came down and said, "Ben, just so you know, flies aren't conscious," I'd be like, okay, that wouldn't particularly surprise me, right?
I mean, a lot of the questions do when we ask,
Like,
can machines think or machines conscious?
uh,
Like kind of the questions about free will, a lot of it has to do with kind of morality and blamability and stuff like this.
well, I was gonna say, I think that similarly, if the voice of God came down and said, "Ben, just so you know, flies are conscious," I don't think that would shock me either. If it said, "Ben, just so you know, flies can think," I would say, with all due respect, "Are you sure?" Right?
Well,
Like,
I'm clearly a better analytic philosopher than you because I would just ask God, what do you mean by those terms?
yeah, fair enough. But I don't like. It doesn't seem wildly out of the question to me that flies could have like uh some sort of like experience of like that they like something that we could call like a sensation or whatever.
I mean, you mentioned
that
last
doesn't
time
seem
that your
that
dog
doesn't seem
has thoughts, right?
what's that?
You
Yeah,
mentioned
yeah,
last time that your dog has thoughts, which I was a bit iffy about.
yeah, yeah. So I think that the saying like the fly, because you know, I think normally in like certainly in folk psychology terms, we would normally describe like dogs and cats as like having, believe in things or not believe in things,
Yeah,
that and
yeah, you can trick them, right, with
uh,
not throwing
yeah,
balls.
yeah. Uh, yeah, sometimes they seem to have false beliefs, like it does seem like there's something going on and it's
And then if you
dog.
take that away, then kind of you seem to be able to explain less things, which seems like a bad way to go.
Yeah, exactly, right. So it's like it seems like there's something going on and it's like little doggy cognition that it doesn't seem unreasonable to describe as like having beliefs. The idea is that like a fly has beliefs, I'd be much more skeptical about, to put it, and like I think that um, and certainly even when you talk about like, certainly if by thinking you mean like reasoning, right? Like I don't, I certainly don't. I mean, look, I don't even really think the dog is doing much of that. I don't. I think a fly is presumably doing exactly none of that. But one of the points I make in the essay is that, and maybe we're jumping pretty far ahead here, but I mean, it might still be worth saying quickly is just like oftentimes, I think in popular discussions, this, and frankly, even sometimes in academic discussions of it, certainly historically important academic discussions of it, these, like the question about thinking and consciousness are oftentimes sort of run together, but it's at the very least seems to be like an open question whether they should be, right? Like, in other words, it
Right.
seems like
Yeah, definitely.
it certainly seems plausible that you could be conscious without, well, certainly without thinking in the sense of reasoning or being self-conscious or anything like that.
Yeah, I
And
wanted to kind of establish the parts of your essay, which is first
yeah,
talking about the Iraq War for a while,
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
and then kind of you go through not really talking about
Yeah,
ChatGPT,
there's the
but
fuck you New York Times part before get into the what Chomsky actually says. Yeah,
you try and talk about thinking and consciousness and what that might mean in general
yeah,
for machines, talking about Turing, the Turing test, and the
mhm,
Chinese room, and so on. Then you talk specifically about kind of Chomsky's take on the capacity of this machine, and then at the end you talk about the moral bit, which
yeah,
my forthcoming essay for Sublation kind of focuses all on the moral bit.
yeah.
So do you want to go through the Turing test and the
Sure,
Chinese
yeah,
room, or I don't know, like
yeah,
we
yeah.
don't
I think
have
it's
to.
probably worth doing a few minutes of that, like just if only for scene setting. But I think it's also intrinsically interesting, and it is an important part of what's going on in the essay. So, um, yeah. So think about question like if we're trying like the sort of big question being asked in the Chomsky editorial in the Times, and in broader discussions about this is like maybe you could just ask in the broadest terms is like to what extent has ChatGPT and other similar systems, to what extent have they been able to replicate like the most important things about human minds or come close to replicating them or at least signal the future possibility of replicating them or anything like that, right? And then you obvious follow-up question is okay, well, which things about human minds are we interested in? And and so like one thing obviously we think is really important about human minds is that we actually do have conscious experiences, and also and another one is that we think, right, like, and oftentimes again I think in historically important discussions these things, those two issues have kind of been run together in a weird way,
Mhm.
right? But when you think like, well, okay, um, whether or not flies have experiences, they're definitely not intelligent in any sense. Uh, and it seems like a good bit of human reasoning that happens we're not consciously aware of, while we're doing it. And So it does seem like those things could come apart. And oftentimes, people on sort of both sides of the could the machines do all that stuff question aren't, haven't always differentiated between those as clearly as they should. So, uh, Alan Turing had his classic paper from 1950, "Computing Machines and Intelligence," where he's laid out what would come to be known as the Turing test. Has um, I think is mostly talking in terms of thinking or intelligence, and but he does blur the line a little bit about whether how all that relates to consciousness in the paper. And certainly, many people have taken the point of the Turing test as being, well, do we count, like true AI would be AI that was conscious, and like if you pass the test, we should think that you're conscious. And like John Searle had responded to it, certainly seems to think that like he's showed that this is wrong.
But
If
I'm pretty sure that lots of things have passed the Turing test, and especially though a lot of that is to do with humans being like enormously gullible.
Yeah, so it's maybe worth saying a second about like what the test is, and I do think it's worth talking just a little bit about the paper, because most people who throw around the term, I think, don't bother to read it, which is a shame because it's an interesting read. Um, but so If anybody's ever seen, several years ago, there was a Hollywood movie about Turing called The Imitation Game. It was played by Benedict Cumberbatch. And one of the funny things about that movie is that it never explained where the title comes from. It never, like there was never any actual mention of The Imitation Game in it. I assume that
Sorry,
there
because it
must
was about the Enigma machine, right?
yeah.
The
I mean, a
film,
lot of
obviously.
yeah. So, Lorraine, a lot of it's about the World War II code breaking, and there is this sort of stuff in it about how, Turing is kind of the this important father of like computers as they would come to exist or whatever. But they never really talk about the Imitation Game. So the Imitation Game is this game which, as described in the paper, it made it sound like this is a game that he'd actually played. The human on human version of it, which is you have a man and a woman in separate rooms. Ideally, they're typing rather than than like writing longhand, so you can't tell with the handwriting which is the man and which is the woman. And um, and then people pass in questions, and and the people in the two rooms type up the answers, and everybody's supposed to guess which is the man and which is the woman. And the point is, and he says essentially that if we got to the point where AIs, right, computing machines, in the language of the paper, could fool people in the imitation game about whether they're a human or an AI as often as people in the original imitation game would fool people about whether they were men or women, then we should conclude that roughly, I mean, uh, there's some ambiguity about the way he frames it in the paper, but roughly we should conclude that the AI is genuinely thinking that this is real artificial intelligence, if it's done this. And then John Searle comes along famously and says, doesn't really show that. And you know,
Right. I mean, it seems very unconvincing if you think about it, right?
yeah,
Like you could have a machine which you would have to be insanely complex and would be a ridiculous brute force method, but you could eventually just correlate kind of every English question
yeah,
to like a single system, and you could have literally the most simple though incredibly kind of like horizontally lengthy system which would pass a Turing test.
yeah. So that, in a way, this is kind of Searle's point, and I do like your point, by the way, that it's like, look, I mean, I even kind of in my essay, I kind of reflect the usual assumption that this hasn't quite happened, but honestly, in the terms that Turing originally set it out, it's probably not a reasonable set. No, it's happened tons of times, right? What are you talking about, right? Like they have a
I mean, the main problem now on Twitter is that kind of discourse has degenerated to such a degree that it's impossible. Like
Yeah,
if you look into the replies of any Ukraine war post, it's
yeah,
impossible for me to tell if these people are humans or bots, and specifically they're humans which are acting like bots, who just say the same things over and over and over again.
yeah. I mean, look, I'm sure every single day people are actually tricked about whether they're interacting, with a human or an AI.
But it's normally for. I'm just pointing out that it's bad because we're actually mistaking humans for bots now.
So there you go. Yeah, imitation game has been passed in both directions. Yeah, it's so. But I guess roughly what people mean now when they say that nothing has passed the Turing test is that it's like nothing has been convincing, like gives like convincing human level answers for long enough, given the right kind of interrogation and something like that, right? And there's some, and you could question whether the goalposts are shifting a little bit there, but okay, roughly that's true, and it's not, even with ChatGPT, there are, as we'll get into, definitely some giveaways if you interact with these enough. But also Cyril's point is, even if we did, even if we made an AI that was like much better than even the stuff that exists now, decades after Cyril was originally writing all this, right? That actually like sailed through the test every time. Um, Searle doesn't think that we should conclude that that this would be conscious, which again, I think Turing and Searle, at least, I'm sure, probably most people now are more careful about this, but certainly both Turing and Searle uh, are, neither of them are doing a good job, I think, in their original papers on this, and clearly differentiating the intelligence question from the consciousness question. But the but we shouldn't conclude Searle thinks either one of those, because it's not like, I mean, look, one way of thinking about this is, sure, the fact that something acts like it's conscious is maybe some evidence that it is, but then that could be overwhelmed by the evidence from our knowledge of how the trick was pulled, right? That
Yeah, yeah.
that's
How
like
the machine works.
yeah. And so we know that this is just, mindless symbol manipulation. So the metaphor is that, if you have somebody who doesn't speak Chinese, who is like who's in a room where they have people pass in questions in Chinese, and the person has some incredibly elaborate rule book that, like sort of impossible Borgesian kind of rule book that has that they can look up, they can look up every combination of Chinese symbols that's passed into them, and then they can find out what a convincing response would be, and then they write down those symbols and they pass it out and say, okay, somebody who knew how to use the rule book to do this wouldn't thereby know Chinese, and also like there's no, could be in the room for 100 years and you never learn Chinese from that way, right? Just has nothing to do with understanding Chinese. And similarly, um, Searle thinks that something analogous is going on when, like, it doesn't really matter, like, since we know again that it's just programmed to, respond to certain inputs with certain outputs, that there's nothing, there's no understanding or consciousness going on at any point in the process. So that's Searle. There are standard replies to Searle, like, people say, well, maybe this is not a, maybe this is not a good metaphor, maybe, because like you're sort of thinking of the AI as like the guy in the room, but maybe if you think of the AI as the entire system, the stacks of characters, the rule book, the guy, the whole thing, there's some sense in which the entire system knows Chinese. I'm not totally sure what I make of that argument. I never have been, right? But
Do you know what's
that's
very funny?
yeah,
I built a Chinese room for when I was trying to pass my French class as a,
yeah,
as a teenager in high school where I didn't know French and was very bad at learning French. And I had a spoken French exam. So instead of just trying to learn these series of set responses, um, I we were allowed to take a cheat sheet into the exam, which had a very small limit of number of words you could put on it, but an infinite amount of symbols you could put on it. So instead of learning the meaning of the French words, I broke them down into syllables, attached each syllable to a symbol, um, and then just read out these series of symbols without understanding what the sentence meant, which is far more fucking effort than just learning it.
Yeah,
But something
yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
actually very much did.
There you go. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a like. I think Searle's argument feels most plausible to me as an argument for not attributing consciousness to AIs.
Certainly
Uh,
to quite kind of simple machinery, right? That kind of
yeah,
input outputs in kind of like a systemic kind of non-probabilistic kind of set way, as I suggested kind of before, of a machine which just like has a one-to-one relationship with certain things.
yeah. Um, I mean, and he himself kind of hedges his bets a little bit on the okay. So are you saying that you can't build a machine that's conscious? And he's like, well, I mean, our brains are machines that are conscious, so
Right.
clearly you can. Um, he's not he's not going to come out and endorse like Cartesian dualism, as the God infused our brains with immaterial souls or something. So he thinks, but he just thinks that like you shouldn't think that a machine that works the way that computers as we know them work or whatever is conscious. Um, and um, and I think that one of the things I suggest in the essay is that uh, you know other than whoever the hell those 3% of people are who said in the Phil surveys that they thought that existing AIs are conscious. Uh,
Which is kind of the
like,
percentage on fill papers for philosophers who will say anything, who
yeah,
just pick an option either because they're really old and pick the wrong thing, or because they're just contrarians.
yeah, that seems right. Like, I kind of think that at least when it comes to either ChatGPT or anything that was like basically just a more sophisticated version of the same kind of thing that ChatGPT is, right? Like, so I mean, look, maybe you could have something, that was built out of silicon chips or whatever, but that like sort of in some bizarre way replicated the structure of a human brain and like, uh, maybe even Cyril could come out of retirement and say, yeah, okay, it's probably conscious, but at least with anything that basically works the way that ChatGPT worked, even if it were a more sophisticated version, I kind of tend to think that, in a push comes to shove, truth serum, what do you really think kind of way, we're all sort of on Searle's side of the argument. In other words, like, yeah, I mean, there was that like Google engineer who was convinced that AI he was working with, was conscious, and like 99.99% of everybody else were like, "Oh, look at this lunatic!" Right? I mean, let's
I
hold
mean,
him up.
it's. I think it's a very human instinct, which you'd be embarrassed to actually come out and say. But we assign consciousness to a lot of things, right?
Sure.
People have great sympathies for their Roombas,
Yeah.
and for even completely like non-autonomous things like their car, they humanize to a great degree. Um,
What? Right.
and
So
so,
it's like,
kind of, you think humans will at least instinctively kind of massively overestimate these things, even if we are embarrassed to then actually come out and say it.
so it's given that it's actually kind of striking that like as good at in certain respects, and we're going to talk about the limitations, but as good in certain respects that ChatGPT is at imitating, human reasoning. It
I mean, I think the
is,
problem with ChatGPT is it isn't physical. It isn't walking around. Like if you put a chat machine kind of if you and if you let it speak,
uh,
if you put it on like a robot body and let it speak and understand spoken English, which
uh,
it should surely you
sure,
can very easily
yeah,
do that. If it was walking around, you could speak to it and it could speak back to you. All bets are off. It's exactly the same thing, but just because of the kind of like the physicality of it, I think lots of people would be convinced.
yeah. Uh, so again, I don't think like I mean, you're right. That seems right to me that like there probably would be more people who'd be tricked in that scenario, right? But it's like I think like right now, hardly anybody is inclined to attribute consciousness to
Right, and
ChatGPT.
so we don't want to just attack that because it's pointless, right? We don't want to just tilt at windmills, which I think a lot of people end up doing with ChatGPT.
Yeah,
Um,
and I
to,
think
to tilt at
I,
another windmill. Go
well, I
on.
was going to say I think that I think if people reflect on why they're not attributing consciousness to ChatGPT, I kind of don't, I don't think it's because of the sort of weird quirks and giveaways that it has right
Right.
now, right? Like I think that if we ironed all that out, right, I think you still wouldn't, right? Or like they have a if so that suggests that I think in some ways, and God knows, maybe we're all wrong, right? Maybe maybe those 3% of people who picked the wrong option on the survey are right, whatever. But like, I think a more interesting question, just in terms of like sort of existing areas of disagreement, is not so much, is ChatGPT or could its foreseeable successors be conscious, as could they reason, or like could they replicate the most important things about human reasoning, apart perhaps from the fact that we're conscious of the fact that we're reasoning, right? Like so, and I think that even that that like even if we just sort of limit our sights to that, like that's kind of an interesting enough question in itself, and that there are some pretty real reasons to question that, right? That Chomsky and his co-authors, go into in their essay, that that you could, that like obviously what I'm ultimately most interested in the end is the point about moral reasoning, but even before that, right, even just sort of reasoning in general, right? I mean, like there are plenty enough reasons to be skeptical
A
about
really
even
a
that.
really interesting example that someone gave, which proves to me, for instance, that if we talk about a very specific question, like can ChatGPT understand English? The answer is definitely no.
Uh,
And the example, I mean, people create lots of these examples, but a really good one was it was given the Monty Hall problem,
uh-huh.
but the guy had changed the percentage in it so that it was exactly the same text, and it had to be like that to kind of fool it in this way. But the where it says, there's a 1/3 chance of the car being behind this door, he just instead changed it to 100%. And it's to replicate not switching, which is meant to be the wrong answer, right?
Right.
And so the ChatGPT obviously just said stuck to the normal answer, and he's like, no, come on, like you have to understand, I've told you it's 100% chance, and it like insisted that no, the normal standard answer is right because that's what it has in its data sets. It's not actually reading and responding to what you write. It's engaged in this process of wild mass guessing. And
Yeah.
then this was kind of fixed from the top down eventually. But I think the interesting question is if we advance to a point where you can't do this kind of trick, where it does actually kind of read each individual statement in some sense and kind of responds to it on its own terms, using in some way its massive amount of information to respond to each question really on a strong way in its own terms, does it then understand English?
Yeah. Um, hold on just one second, Stefan.
It's fine. This can be cut.
Okay. Yep. Might not. Might not be. Okay, sorry. I just got a message that seemed important. This ended up only being 30 seconds, so maybe we'll leave it in. But in any case, so yeah. I mean, I think that the like this is I think this is a pretty telling example of some of the stuff that Chomsky and Co. I will just with many apologies to
I
the
mean, many greater people than them have been put in Chomsky and Co. They shouldn't worry about it.
yeah, exactly right. The So I think that the that this is a pretty telling example of what Chomsky and Co. are talking about, right? Uh, that when they say the human mind is not like ChatGPT and its ilk, a lumbering statistical engine for pattern matching, gorging on hundreds of terabytes of data and extrapolating the most likely conversational response or most probable answer to a specific question. Um, on the contrary, the human mind is a surprisingly efficient and even elegant system that operates with small amounts of information, does not seek to infer brute correlations among data points, but to create explanations. And that point about creating explanations is a big part of uh, what they think it can't do, right? So something I say in the essay to sort of ground what it is that I think that ChatGPT, um, like just in a superficial way, right? Like what ChatGPT seems to be bad at, right? That is like a couple things like that are actually not even as extreme as that Monty Hall example, but I think somewhat telling along the same lines, which is that given certain kinds of factual questions, it'll do two things that are sort of weird giveaways. One, it will refrain from, like hold back from making factual judgments that would be very, very easy for anyone equipped with a standard human brain and a tiny fraction of the information available to ChatGPT. And on the flip side, it just makes stuff up in a very strange way, right? So my favorite example that I cited the essay of the first one is my friend Derek asked it, "Can why did the Romans abandon their lunar colonies?" Uh, and um, and I actually think the one I'm quoting might not even be the best one. I think earlier he might have managed to trick it more completely with that and be like, "Oh, nobody really knows." But the in this case, the one I'm quoting, he asked it that, and it says, "Hat can't fool me, right? The Romans didn't have lunar colonies." But my favorite part of its answer is, "You may be thinking of another civilization," because it's like essentially it's like, oh, all right, we've scanned the Roman part of the database, nothing about that there. But don't want to rush to judgment here about whether maybe the Babylonians or Phoenicians had lunar colonies. um, so yeah, I think that's one
I mean,
side. And
clearly the bot has just picked up a lot of information about the Finno-Korean hyperwar.
then,
Unless, they could have had moon colonies, so it's restraining judgment.
yeah, there you go. And then an example, on which I am um, an example on which I am in a particularly good position to judge is ChatGPT's answer to "Tell me about Ben Burgess,"
Right.
and in the course of that answer, it does the opposite of holding back from making easy factual judgments, because there's about 3 paragraphs of stuff that's like 95% of it's accurate, but then it also says Burgess is known for his work in logic and critical thinking, has published several books on the topic, including Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, and Logic for the Uninitiated, an introduction to formal logic, which is a book it just made up It definitely has classic zero books title syntax, but that book doesn't exist, which is very weird. And then at the end, it says the final sentence again after a bunch of stuff that's mostly right, some of it's a little off. It says, in addition to his academic and political work, Burgess is also a musician and has released several albums of original music, which is news to me. The And so I think it does go to the point about how because the stuff that it does that's very good at sounding like a person answering these questions, like a knowledgeable person answering these questions, is ultimately about gorging on this vast stockpile of information and using like sort of lumbering around with these statistical correlations. It does tend to do what Chomsky and co identify in their article is it tends to either under generate, as in the lunar colony case, or over generate, as in this like the albums of original music that I've created, and the book I did write, and this is like. And as part of all of this, they say, like, the thing about creating explanations, I think a lot of people who are just kind of giving this a quick read and then like sort of dunking on it on Twitter, I think probably miss the point, because there are cases where it's sort of said, like, Chomsky and his co-authors will say, well, like you ask ChatGPT, ChatGPT is good at describing and correlating. It's not good at forming explanations, that like coming up with explanations of things, or it's good at sort of spitting out of like this vast array of information. Here's a thing that's true, but it's very bad at sort of identifying stuff that isn't or couldn't be the case, which goes along with the thing about explanations. And a lot of people just sort of said, "Oh, dumbass! I just asked it why something happened, and it told me the correct answer."
Which is very like Plato, shadow on the wall. You're deliberate. Like, you're acting like a bot there when you say that, where you're refusing to actually think about what's going on and just completely looking at the surface level of the things that are in front of you.
Yeah, no, exactly, right? Because it's like, sure, there are lots of prompts to which ChatGPT will respond by giving correct causal explanations, but it's doing that because within its database, it has 10 gajillion people giving exactly the same causal explanation. And they're not, like, Chomsky's point is not that ChatGPT doesn't have the capacity to accurately describe causal explanations that are already out there, or to accurately describe claims about what isn't or couldn't be the case that are already out there. Like, it's like, yeah, I'm sure if you ask ChatGPT if it's possible to accelerate past the speed of light, it'll say no, because, that there are, again, like 100 quintillion authors who said no, that it has immediate access to. But the point is, what it can't do is take the information, all this information that it has, and sort of do new causal reasoning of its own, or sort of do new like reasoning about, given all the stuff that is true, what couldn't be true wouldn't or couldn't be true of its own. And I think the Monty Hall example that you just mentioned is perfect for that, right? Because it's like, yeah, it can sort of look, it's seen the Monty Hall problem before, and in a sense, you can't fool it by messing with the numbers, because it'll still recognize its correlations. This is the Monty Hall problem, and what the correct response is, except that if you've changed the numbers to the point where the correct answer is no longer the correct answer, then in order to do this, it doesn't just note a correlation. Oh, this is the problem and this is the answer. It has to do new reasoning of its own and say, oh no, wait, actually that wouldn't be the answer if that were it.
And
And
thus it can successfully imitate human reasoning when we aren't paying attention, we haven't read properly, and we're just like the kind of the answer an undergrad would give when they haven't heard a single thing you've said for the past 10 minutes.
totally, yeah. I mean, I do think like one thing I will absolutely say about ChatGPT. I mean, one of the first responses I like. So you know, Nathan Robinson is like kind of obsessed with ChatGPT for over the course of the last few months that's existed. He's sent me many like screenshots of his interactions with it, and I include a couple of them in the essay, and some of them like he'll ask me about philosophy, and like sometimes it's actually pretty good. Like I'm a big fan of the explain Russell's paradoxes if you were speaking to a dog. Like no,
Sometimes it's too literal. Like when you ask it to explain something like I'm five, it actually does that as if you're explaining to a 5-year-old, which is not whatever anyone actually wants
no,
when they ask for that.
that's true, right? But it's like, but I will say, even the ones that were kind of mediocre, it's like, I mean, my immediate thought was like, oh shit, this doesn't really come up for anything I'm teaching right now, because like the only class I'm teaching right now for Rutgers is this thing essentially about this class essentially about probabilistic reasoning. We don't do read responses, but it's like, man, next time I do something where I would otherwise do this, like if you're just sort of doing the like standard undergraduate thing where you just have people read something and then like write a little half page about it, well, that's done, right? Because like most of these like even the shitty chat gpt answers along those lines bear a very close resemblance to like
Right. When it first came out, I tested it on Nietzsche and Marx, and what it did was it got things wrong. But obviously, because of how its sample is structured, it got things wrong which undergraduates and normal people constantly get wrong about Marx and Nietzsche.
yes.
As in, it thought like Marx was, moralistically condemning capitalism and struggling for justice or whatever,
uh,
and it thought Nietzsche was promoting master morality. And these are both just two very common misunderstandings.
sure.
So it can very easily imitate that.
Yeah, I mean, like in fact veered into areas of like actual exegetical controversy, but like I'm sure it's giving the dumb undergraduate versions of the
Yeah.
positions you don't like, but they have but yeah, I mean, I think yeah, it's so yeah, like I think it's like that, yes. Like in fact, oftentimes the sort of mediocre ones that it'll give, like even if it's like yes, stuff it'll get wrong or things that student in an intro class would totally plausibly get wrong, the the respects in which it's mediocre are often like the sort of respects in which one of those reading responses would be mediocre. Like you sort of have three pieces of information, you're going to spread it over 500 words.
Yeah.
Like it does a lot of that, and it's
Yeah,
like,
that's what
yeah,
I'm saying. You're just not famous enough. That's why I had to make shit up.
yeah, there you go, exactly. And then like it's got, yeah, it'll do like honestly, and like God, even occasionally making something up along those lines, right? Is like, yeah, that's something the student in intro class might do, right? They're just like,
Yeah,
they'll
or
just
someone writing copy,
yeah,
especially if there were two Ben Burgesses on Google.
yeah. Or like maybe it like maybe somebody who sort of half like maybe got me half confused with Jason's. They said the thing about music or like whatever. Like there's a lot of ways,
Yeah,
or
I
like
mean, this kind of problem that,
I
well,
mean,
I can't.
if you're willing to, like, the point is like, I think at this point, if you're willing to live with a C plus or B minus on an assignment like that, like, I mean, you kind of might as well, right?
Yeah,
Just do Chat GPT because it'll definitely give you something that will at least get a C plus or a B minus. And I know there are programs that claim to be able to say like whether something is probably generated by it, but one, there's going to be an inevitable arms race about that, where like the
and often
technology.
they're run by the same companies, and they use the information from one to input into the other to input the other. Like the arms race is just between themselves.
Yeah, Well, okay, that sounds very profitable. It's
Yeah,
not like
exactly.
a rot rock war. So yeah, I think also it's. Um, I also think like, but I also don't know like if you come up with like, because like usually like if student like cheats on something, you're like, oh, that doesn't sound like you wrote it, and you could like Google it and just find wherever they got it, like in their Google search, right? Then like you have them dead to rights. But it's like if you said like, hey, I have this program that says there's a 70% chance that like you didn't write this, and you say, yeah, but I'm in the other 30%. Like I don't know, I don't know how far that goes.
I
In
mean,
like,
I was reading what Professor was saying about this, and one was saying that he doesn't think it's that much of a problem because it's almost impossible to prove like very certainly that people are plagiarizing often, right? But that students nearly always confess.
yeah, um, there is some truth to that, although not always.
Yeah, yeah.
And I also think it's like
And
often
those are
because
probably the people who won't confess are the most likely to use it, probably.
exactly, and also again, very often with like traditional plagiarism, you could just say, okay, word for word, this is where it comes
Yeah.
from.
But
Um,
the thing is with it being like C plus B minus or whatever
uh,
is the kind of the fundamental reason I haven't been really fascinated. Well, I've wrote a lot about it, but I haven't really been. I don't use the tool very much of ChatGPT, and I have downloaded on my computer a very good AI art program which I can run
uh,
off my own graphics card, which I was initially obsessed with, but became very bored with very quickly, and only had a revival when I was doing very particular projects for me and my friends, because it really struggles to make anything original. It
uh,
really, really struggles, and that's the thing I'm actually interested in. Like, yes, sure, it can produce B minus responses, but so can I. Or I can pay like $1 to like make an Indian write it for me on these uh, microtask websites. And so that's kind of the my real lack of interest with it, and why unlike Nathan Robertson, I haven't at all been obsessed with it.
uh,
Um, but I think this is a good time to segue into the moral thing because this is something that people have really been going on about lately, where there's a real fear that if we don't have a moral panic about AI, then we'll never have a moral panic again.
yeah. So on the question of general reasoning, um, I mean, I can, basically what I say is, look, I think that certainly from my own impressions of interacting with ChatGPT, what Chomsky and co say about its limitations seems like at least somewhat plausible to me. On the question of whether there is nevertheless some like emergent ability here that's more interesting than you might think, or whether like successor systems might be less inclined, might like actually manage to overcome some of these limitations. I'm a bit more agnostic, just because there's like a complicated empirical question there. I do think it's harder to disprove Chomsky on this than people on Twitter think it is, right?
Yeah.
But
Shockingly, clever man is not idiot.
yes, exactly. I think clever man is not idiot. Is he right? We'll see, right? As better AIs come out in the future, but what I do find interesting, because it does veer most into something that I do have more settled views about, is this question of moral reasoning, which is a question you could ask from a couple of different directions. Uh, and I think what you're probably primarily seeing that you reported just now, what you're maybe most sort of uh, responded to, I know, in what you just wrote, right, is the sort of like people raising this problem, right? So like it's often called the alignment problem. So it's like, in other words, how do you align AIs with human values before they go all Skynetty on you? And so one question is like, okay, well, how much should you worry about them going all Skynetty on you? And I don't know that I particularly have a view on that. One thing that I will just point out is that I think most people who raise this question seem to be incredibly unserious about it. Like the people who seem to be like who claim to be like really really worried about it, because with um,
I mean,
you
people
know
who've carved themselves out this niche as AI safety people have massive, massive incentives to massively exaggerate how close this threat is.
yeah, and it's again I just like this is sort of I saw the party read of what you wrote that you'd sort of mentioned that some of these people have sort of cooed the effective altruism movement, and that's an example I find particularly egregious because like when people say, oh, effective altruism, uh, which I mean, look, even the original version I had a lot of problems with. I wrote an article about this for the print issue I think before last of Jacobin. But this sort of the new the AI safety version of effective altruism, where you say, oh, actually, the biggest what you should really worry about is the biggest long term threat, which is like you know AI is doing something horrible and destructive to humans. Um, it's like okay, but like the idea that people should give you all this money to worry
Right,
about it
that
is like
AI is so dangerous and coming so soon that it's more efficient to give you money to live in Los Angeles in great comfort than it is to buy malaria nets for Africans.
exactly. It's like to pay your rent and your Whole Foods bills while you like sit around worried about AI one day becoming dangerous. It's like
Where you spend a lot of time typing things in the chat GPT and then getting scared, which is literally like making up a monster under your bed.
yeah, I mean good work if you could get it, but like it's not like I'm very skeptical that there just is any like if we just assume for the sake of argument that AI is becoming dangerous is this huge civilizational threat in the long term. And I think that's certainly a premise that could be disputed. But if you do accept that, okay, great. What's the plan, guys? Like, what's the what is the conceivable scenario by which like rich people giving you a bunch of money to sit in comfort worried about it will lead to a solution to it? I mean, it's like, are you going to start the
And I
Butlerian
mean,
jihad here? I mean, what's the
as I write in the article, my problem is that specifically these people, these effective altruist people, are like hardcore utilitarians, hardcore consequentialists who don't believe in any kind of threshold. Those are the last people I want whispering in the ears of a general AI as it's born.
yes,
The
yes,
last people in the world, because they're talking about what if we unleashed like a virus bomb which killed 99% 0.9% of the population. But of any human population in the world, these people are the ones that would most find it easy to justify unleashing a virus bomb which would kill 99.9% of people. Because all that would need to happen would for the AI to convince them that it's best in the long term, which
right.
because it's very clever, it would be very easy for it to do. And it would have no they would have no backstop of saying, no, that's wrong in of itself.
Yeah, spit out a scenario where the virus kills them painlessly, and like it's and the survivors have much better lives in the long term, blah blah blah. Yeah, absolutely. Hard cosign on that. But yeah, I think the like I mean, look, I've talked to exactly one person ever who I'll sort of take his concern about this seriously, which is Ethan from the Confronting Capital YouTube channel, who's lied about this, is that um, AIs are potentially dangerous, and the solution is to nationalize all research into them because it's like the equivalent of having like corporations own their own private nukes. So it should be in
Right.
the hands of a cautious government bureaucracy, and it's like, all right, that is at least a coherent position. The this anything that I can, as far as I can tell, right? Anything that's like, oh, give me money and I'll think about it, right? Like those guys, I don't think have a
I think it's
coherent.
that, and let us talk to them. which really I think overestimates their own intellect and charisma. But I think that's basically the whole deal.
Well, and it also gets to what I'm talking about, right? Like, the question that, like, the reason that Chomsky and his co-authors are raising this is not so much because they're worried about, the AI apocalypse,
Right. They're
as
more worried about the other more immediate concern, which is the concern of the people who own like OpenAI, that it's going to be like racist online.
yeah. So, and their point about it, which I mean, they're raising just in order to strengthen their argument that ChatGPT is, like, and I should, so they're raising it to strengthen their case that ChatGPT can't really replicate the most important things about human minds.
Yeah.
Is say, oh look, this is a thing that humans can do, moral reasoning, and it can't. And I should say something we never really said earlier, but that like might be worth pausing to just go back and say for a second is that um, anybody who says, hold on, okay, granted, it would have been really nice to invite Chomsky to the New York Times to weigh in on Iraq, but putting that aside, like, oh, this is kind of random, right? Like why him on this, right? Like, because I think if you basically know him as that linguistics guy who, said something rather about linguistics you're probably not very familiar with, and like he's a big critic of American foreign policy, it might seem a little bit random, but since the Chomskyan revolution and linguistics that also helped to give birth to or certainly give shape to like cognitive science in general, is this multidisciplinary effort that now exists, is all about thinking about the ways that the deep structure of human minds gives rise to language. And so I think thinking about the ways in which the deep structures of human minds are different from what at least the kind of artificial intelligence we're currently working on.
Well, I mean,
Uh,
ChatGPT was put by some people to have owned him because it was
yeah,
it's meant to understand English, which
right.
obviously, as I said earlier, I think it definitely doesn't. But
Yeah,
it is a very specific thing where people have recently been like, Chomsky, you're fucking owned, and so
yeah,
he's written a
yeah.
reply to the New York Times.
Yeah, yeah. So I think this is like much closer to his core interests than people might realize. And But this is also the part of the editorial that I kind of most firmly disagree with, because I think that the problem, as you say, that they're identified is a sort of specific version of the alignment problem that I think, given the context which they're raising it in, I say in the essay it might be more evocative to just call like the moral idiocy a problem with
What name?
AI, which is like the fact, the way in which it's not capable of forming moral judgments. Now, of course, the reason that it's not capable of forming moral judgments is that its programmers have very consciously and deliberately neutered it from being able to do so. But then Chomsky and Co.'s point is, okay, but why did they have to do that? Right? And the reason they had to do that is because of some of these past experiences with automated systems where people like do things like trick the system into being incredibly racist, has like made them very leery about it. It's like, well, if we just let this thing loose to be like, to like express moral, you know, like express, right? I mean, put aside all the consciousness questions, but like, express moral opinions, God knows what horrified, depraved shit it's going to come up with. So, like, to stay on the safe side, let's neuter it. Let's make it refrain from doing that. And so this is where the subtitle of my essay comes from, right? So it's Chomsky on ChatGPT, are machine learning systems like concentration camp guards? Because one of the things they say in the op-ed is that because it's been so, what ChatGPT has essentially been programmed to do is to present itself the way that like Nazis tried to escape prosecution after.
It did confuse me for a second, the kind of thing with Chomsky and your title, because I don't associate primarily concentration camp guards with trying to escape justice, but guarding
Uh,
concentration camps. So
sure.
I was a bit
Yeah.
confused about how they were similar, but I got it in the end.
Yeah, yeah. The same way that like people who are like concentration camp guards would then say, like when captured after the war, no, no, it's not my fault. I was just following orders, right? It's like essentially, essentially, Chomsky's point is that you try to ask ChatGPT these moral questions, and it'll sort of present itself with far more justification. The way that like Nazis after the war would present themselves essentially as the kind of entity incapable of making independent moral judgments, um, and and then the real so it's true it does do that, and of course they're also right about on the first level about the reason that it does that, which is that it does that like the programmers are rationally worried that it'll say all kinds of things that'll horrify people if it's like let loose
Yeah,
to express.
and then journalists will write articles about them, and then they'll make less money.
Yeah, exactly, right. So safer to neuter it. And so the real question, like the real moral idiocy, isn't the refusal that it's been programmed with to express judgment. It's the reason that it's had to be programmed to refrain from expressing judgments, which is that we just don't trust it to like make value judgments we're not going to find grotesque. And Chomsky's explanation of this um, is essentially, well, this is just a more particular instance of these sort of general cognitive limitations of these systems that think about all that stuff about either over generating or under generating on factual issues. That they say it can't balance creativity with constraint the way that human minds do, and that when we sort of reason from moral principles, we're doing that. And so it's these general cognitive limitations that make it incapable of doing good moral reasoning. And I think that, and this is the part where I most clearly disagree, because I think that that's importantly wrong. That I think that it's not that. Look, it could be that it has all the cognitive limitations that they say it does. In fact, I think at least the current version probably does have quite a few of the cognitive limitations they say it does. But I don't think that's the sort of most fundamental problem leading to the moral idiocy. I think there's this deeper problem. There's the Humean point, right, about facts and values, which is that ultimately, um, like when I mean, look, even if we came up with a long list of plausible sounding moral principles and programmed them, and like again, as you say, these effective altruism freaks are the last people in the world I want like loaded up an AI with moral principles, because it's just going to be like utilitarian stuff that I think is going to be awful. But like I think that like even if better people, not like them, not your Peter Singers and William McCaskills, do are supplied it with moral principles, and you try like really earnestly to come up with all the plausible moral principles you can think of, and then if it like reasons with flawless human level reasoning from whatever moral principles you give it, I still think the moral results are going to be a lot different than what a sort of normally well-adjusted human would come up with, because
But I guess the important point is you don't think that that can be because we're wrong.
maybe. So okay. So I think that whether we're wrong, like I'm gonna give a really annoying answer here, which is depends what you mean by wrong. So I think that um, like, if you think that there are moral facts that are sort of hanging out in Plato's heaven somewhere, or they're just kind of like hanging from the sky, waiting for us to like come along and find them, uh, I'm sort of politely skeptical of your metaphysical picture. I think that I think that what's typical, I think what's going on, in the sort of basic, the kind of basic human picture that seems right to me is that um, we have moral passions. We have like what the Michael Sloat, who's a virtue ethicist, calls feelings of warmth and chill that we're trying to that we're trying like when we're doing moral reasoning, right? What we're really reasoning about, right, is what sort of how to kind of distill those into something we can explicitly articulate. So, like when Hume says that reason is the slave of the passions, like I think a straightforward way of reading what he's saying there is that like reasoning is really good for figuring out how to carry out the goals that you care about. It's also really good, I think that's something moral reasoning is all about, is like helping you figure out what you really care about, right? That's like, oh, this principle sounds really plausible to me until I start thinking about some things that would follow from it. And then I realize that actually, no, I don't really subscribe to that, or it conflicts with this other principle that's more important to me or whatever. So like reasoning is really good for helping you to figure out which goals you care about. It's really good for helping you figure out how to carry out the goals you care about. But there is, I think, a strong sense in which reasoning can't just sort of like, I mean, this where ultimately I'll side with Hume against Kant. Like reasoning can't just sort of manufacture the goals all by itself. And I think that when I think that the project of moral reasoning is a worthwhile one, right? Because I think that it is, I'm a big fan of self awareness and reflection and sort of thinking about it's like, okay, but like, what, do I actually, think that, is there, like, oh, is my like overall sort of set of commitments coherent here? Like, is there an inconsistency? If so, how should I resolve it? Right? Like, I think that's a worthwhile process to engage in. That like that sort of process of trying our best to hammer our moral intuitions into an internally consistent framework. And I think you can learn a lot from the process. But I also think that um, it's not this. There are limits to our ability to completely capture everything that we morally care about in explicitly articulated principles. And as evidence for that, I would say, look at the last few thousand years of moral philosophy and how people don't tend to uh, easily arrive at universally held consensuses, right? I mean, like that there's or arrive at them at all, or like people. It's like moral philosophy is really, really hard, and it's actually like I think as valuable as the process can be, I also just think that like it's a little bit ridiculous to think, okay, a few more years of thinking hard about this, and we'll succeeded in distilling everything that we care about into explicitly articulated principles that you can give to the AI and program it with, because even if it's flawlessly reasoning from whatever principles you give it, right? The question is, okay, are the principles that you give it, have you managed to essentially upload your entire moral conscience into this set of principles you can program with it? And I'm pretty skeptical of that. I think that I
We
think
should
that
have talked to this earlier, probably, because I think I'm very sus on this point, especially in the sense that if you mean as to say kind of morality is like this, but other things aren't. Because
yeah,
to give another human point,
yeah,
Chomsky talks about kind of causation
yeah.
and an apple falling from a tree and this kind of thing. But obviously, Hume asked us, well, why do we think that? Should I mute
Oh,
you? You got barking.
yeah. Actually, this we probably really will have to cut out. Give me just a second.
Okay, cool.
All right.
Hi.
Well, just in case Gene forgets to cut this out later, I'm not going to say what's going on, but I'll tell you when we stop. But I think that given the entirety of the situation, I think the minimum amount of disruption it's caused has been impressive. But uh, you were just starting to make a different
Yeah,
Humean
I'll
point.
just run it from the top.
Yeah.
On the other Humean point. So the other Humean point I would make is that in the article, and it's kind of like a key thing for Chomsky, is that this AI wouldn't be able to make proper causal connections.
Mm-hmm.
Something you agreed with. But obviously, if we read Hume, Hume critiques arguments from induction, which he critiques the idea that just because something's happened a million times before, we should think it happens in the future. Like, what's the actual logic there? Why should we assume that because something is true going into the past, that it's true going into the future? And there's obviously various answers to this, but I think on some level, how you describe kind of this problem with morality ultimately being based on kind of like seemings or institution or
Intuitions.
intuitions, which can ultimately, in some sense, be justified. If it's a problem, I don't think it's just a problem for morality, and
Yeah.
that in the same way that kind of you need to make some kind of leap of faith to get to morality, you need to make some kind of leap of faith to properly go about induction or similar things, or at least kind of these things aren't fundamentally different. So I don't know if that's what you're suggesting, that kind of morality, and I think it's what you're suggesting, is that morality is like an odd one out here. But I would say that I'm not. That's sus to me, basically.
Yeah. So what I think is that it's I mean, I think that whether or not there are analogous problems that are going to arise in other domains, I think the problem about morality is that an AI at least that was like ChatGPT. Again, like um, could you have something? I don't. I am not particularly inclined to think that there's anything magical about the meat, in human brains. I mean, Searle sometimes does kind of verge into suggesting that there is, but they have but like I think probably not. So could you have something that was, that like was made out of circuits or whatever, but that actually um, was so similar to a human mind, right? That it just had like the same moral feelings that we do. Sure, why not, right? But if we're talking about anything like the kind of AI that currently exists, just a more sophisticated form of it, I think that the problem is with just applying explicit moral principles and reasoning forward from them without being able to sort of check those moral principles against the source, against the sort of moral feelings that we're trying to express as principles. I think that's the sort of that I think that's why you should expect them to be morally idiotic. I mean, the sort of like jokey example I give in at the end of the essay is like, oh, you didn't want me to process the corpses of the babies who died in the fire to make high protein nourishment for the
But,
survivors. Well,
but
that,
kind
that
of
doesn't follow from any of the principles you gave me, right? So they have that's why you should expect it. Now, as far as like whether you're going to get whether you're going to get problems that are to one degree or another parallel in other domains, maybe, right? I think that they have but I just think that my objection to Chomsky on the morality question is that I think that he and his co-authors are underselling how deep the problem goes, right? That like because they're sort of seeing it as a problem with their reasoning, and I see it as a I'd argue that it's also a problem about what it's reasoning from.
But why do you think the AI doesn't have access to these intuitions? Because unless you're kind of going into some kind of qualia thing, because it seems to me on the surface that the AI, in fact, has more access to these intuitions because humans constantly express them all over the open source internet than it actually does to well argued moral principles, which are kept behind a paywall and thus not actually something that ChatGPT currently
Oh,
has access
surely we can finagle ChatGPT a JSTOR account so it could read the
Oh no, I
papers.
mean it will soon, and then it becomes even more dangerous for academics.
Yeah, yeah. I think that there's a again there like what you're suggesting is roughly the the solution, the sort of alignment solution that's consistent with recognizing the human problem, right? That my friend Mark Warren gave that I quote in the paper, right? Which is that you could just sort of give it all of the expressions, right? Basically here are all the cases where humans are expressing moral feelings, and you sort of like extrapolate from that like some grand function that just that correlates from that, and it's like, yeah, could you theoretically get around it that way? Yeah, sure, right. I think that's possible, right? But I think that seems to be a little bit different from what Chomsky's talking about, where he's
Mm.
like, oh, here's the problem with here's a problem with AI reasoning from moral principles. It can't do that as well, as well as humans do. And I would say, well, that might very well be true, right? Like as a particular instance of the more general problem about it replicated human reasoning. But whether it's true or not, I don't think that's the deepest problem. I think the deepest problem is this thing about that is the thing about not having the original moral feelings. Now, I think there are various ways that you could theoretically solve that problem. One of them is that sort of the the sort of trying, that kind of grand function where it just sort of took all of the expressions and tried to come up with the line of best fit, which, I think that's like, I think that's like a sort of more grounded thing that it would be slightly, I mean, obviously it'd be a hell of an engineering feat, but it'd still be like, it's still more easily imaginable, right?
Oh,
Than,
did you see this paper I referenced, The Moral Machine?
tell me about it.
Well, basically, MIT asked 40 million people across the world, which is an
Uh,
incredible number. Um, what should an AI car do in various circumstances? Basically,
yeah,
versions of the trolley problem.
uh,
Should it run down a child or an elder? And obviously, the
uh,
varying results based on different countries. But my problem with that is I just think it's just that's not what we should be doing.
yeah.
I don't know if you disagree. Like,
I guess I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, maybe.
I don't think the we should base the like what AI systems should do on by just asking loads of people
Oh
because
yeah. So,
that's
but I
because
think
you kind
that's
of got
also,
admitting to relativism.
yeah, I think that's also a little bit different too, right? Like in other words, like because I think if you're like, I think one difference between um like again, so on the extreme end, one solution is to just like have an AI in some science fiction future that is actually like what's going on under the hood, is so much more like a human mind
Yeah,
than not, that like it's that like it just genuinely has, or has unconscious versions of, if that's possible, right? Whatever, like but it just genuinely has all the same moral impulses that we do, and then there's just like no issue. Uh, and then like a step less science fiction than that, the more grounded thing would be that you like somehow imagine an AI that is sort of takes all the data points that sort of indicate what people's underlying impulses are, and it sort of extrapolates from that to having like a model for what they're going to be, and that can like play the same functional role in its moral reasoning as just sort of like appeals to intuition have in human moral reasoning. I think, not as hard to imagine as the first one. Still a little hard to imagine. That'd still be like quite something, right? But it's like
Yeah.
it's sort of, but it's like more like it's like you could see how in principle that could happen.
And
But
with something like a large language model.
yeah, yeah, exactly, right. You can see in principle how it could happen with something that wouldn't be too radically different in its intrinsic nature. I think it would still be pretty different, but it wouldn't be
Yeah.
like it wouldn't just be this radically different kind of entity. I
Yeah,
think
it
in the
wouldn't
same
be like,
way.
oh, it has to be like a human brain.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But then, and then finally, I think you could have a version like, but then like I think that's several steps beyond like what the MIT thing is trying to do, because what the MIT thing is doing is it's like asking people for what conclusions they come to. And I think I probably agree with you about that part, because it's like, look, like what conclusions people come to is not really the interesting part, because
Mm.
like most people are pretty bad at this, right? I mean, like that. There's not.
And also will lie to you
Yeah, a lot of them will lie to
systemically.
you. They'll try to think, oh, what sounds decisive, or what's going to make it, like what do I feel gross saying? Like I have a, there are like a lot of things that could like, there's a lot of ways for a lot of noise to get into here. And I also just think like that the what's that this goes back to the question earlier about, okay, could we be wrong? And I said it depends on what you mean by wrong, right? And I think that and even if you don't think that we could be wrong in the sense that there are some sort of non-naturalistic moral facts that are, you know, I don't know, they're like abstract objects like numbers or something, just like waiting for us to discover them. Even if you don't quite think that, right? You can still think it's like, well, okay, but like when it comes to sort of a process of reasoning that's ultimately driven by moral impulses, but like we try to bring those impulses into dialogue with each other and see and like, formulate principles from them, but then like question them, when they interfere with, the original, whatever. Like, look, see above. Moral philosophy is really hard. And like I don't think there are 40 million people in the world who are really that good at it, right? That like I don't think that the I don't think that like any random survey respondent being asked this really hard question, like in a survey, and being like, I guess you should do this, right? I just don't think that that's going to be that informative about what like the results of that process should look like. I think we could definitely be wrong in that sense, right? So I think that the MIT thing is probably barking up the wrong tree. I mean, on the question of whether there are like analogies to this problem about uh, AI, AIs that are programmed with explicit moral principles not having access to the original moral intuitions, whether there are analogies to that problem with other areas, yeah, maybe. I mean, like I think like the like a lot of I mean, I like your framing about a sort of parallel Humean problem, and like if you read like the inquiry concerning human understanding, I mean, part of what Hume says about some of those inferences is like, he's not a skeptic in the sense that he thinks that like the conclusion is wrong, right? He's very clear
Right,
on that.
right. Because he
You know,
obviously, like in the argument for miracles against miracles and stuff like that, he's clearly been inductive, right? His
yeah,
conclusion isn't we shouldn't be inductive, but just like there's a real problem with how this is actually justified. Where it's the same thing with kind of the is-all problem. Like, kind of,
uh,
it might seem obvious, but actually, kind of things are a lot. There's something bad going on here.
yeah, exactly. I mean, he says um, like there's a point in the inquiry concerning human understanding. He's talking about some of these problems about induction and causation and all that, and like he sort of says, look, only what has he said? Like only a fool or a madman like wouldn't come to this conclusion, right? Like that's but the question is like, how are we coming to it? And that's like where the skeptical worry comes in, and like you could say like maybe there's some sort of approximate analogy there to moral intuition, that like that they have it there's stuff that there's stuff under the hood that's like, you could think in a reasonable human way is sort of like helping us to sort of navigate, when it's reasonable to make a causal inference that like, we maybe don't know how to, at least we don't know yet how to equip an AI with those same mechanisms, and whatever that looked like, it would probably be a lot different from a sort of gorging on statistical data and like vomited out, correlations machine.
Right. So we've gone the longest we ever have, though we did have an interruption. How concealed that'll be in the final product, who knows? But I did want to play a game with you just before we go.
Sure.
Actually, no, wait. First, tell us what the next essay is, because we're quite far forward for once, so you should have a good idea.
Yeah. I do. It is an essay that I promised. The title has changed a little bit because I wanted to include the the thing that I'm using to introduce it right in the title, but it's what I promised a while ago. I actually uh, did this in one of the original free will essays that I did, so it's going to be called. Tim Pool, Sam Cedar, and Thanos. How to be a leftist without being a utilitarian or a free will skeptic. So it's basically taking the sort of going way back to that Sam Harris thing, where it's like, okay, when I'm talking about Sam Harris's combination of philosophical views, the only real point I'm making in that essay is just like he's making really bad arguments for them. And then
Right.
like in the Slavoj Žižek, the case for compatibilism essay, I'm taking a step further and being like, okay, at least on the free will part, here's a reason to think that his view's wrong, right? But then the question that's sort of being like, what is the question that's being consciously bracketed in both of those is the politics of all of it, because I do want to separate those out. I'd say like, okay, is this correct is one question, and then like how does it fit with our politics is another question. But like what I wanted to sort of steer directly into for this one is the way that a lot of leftists, in my experience, certainly of a lot of leftists, the online variety, want to sort of feel like that Harris-esque combination of views that they the only moral principle we care about is utility maximization. We don't really think that people are autonomous agents, making free decisions. Like
Which I
they,
think is a very easy path to insane totalitarianism.
yeah, I think so too. So yes, I think that like a lot of people think, oh well, see, I don't like conservatives and
You
libertarians.
should you should title it "Principles that we shouldn't teach any future general AI."
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I want to make the case that actually left politics, or at least the most sort of historically attractive kind of left politics, is actually you know separate for the question of whether those views are correct, which I've argued elsewhere that they're not, right? But it's like I also want to say it's like actually people leftists who are attracted to those views because they think that those are a good fit with the left program haven't thought about it enough, and that I think a lot of the things that we most care about are not actually adequately captured by that. So that's the point for next week. But before we go, you had a game you want to play.
I had a game, so I asked ChatGPT to give me fake zero books titles, and I wanted you to rate from 1 to 10 or 0 to 10 how zero books you think they are. I'm
Nice.
not going to do all 10. I'm going to do a few of them, but I think this is a fun game. So first off, revolutionizing consciousness: a guide to psychedelic activism.
Ooh, that's pretty zero booksy. I think that's got to be at least a 7 out of 10.
Okay. What about the intersectional paradox: the limit of identity politics?
Uh, hmm. It's not quite as zero booksy as the first one, but it's still very zero booksy. That's like maybe a 5.5.
What about against empathy? Against empathy, a Nietzschean critique of contemporary morality.
That's so zero books that if you told me that existed, I'd be like, yeah, probably.
Right,
That's like a 9 or something. That's very good.
right. And this one, which I think might actually tend a bit too far much, but you can say the death of expertise, how anti intellectualism is killing democracy.
Ooh. That is a really interesting borderline example because the thesis feels a little bit off, but like it's yeah, it's like at least a 5 out of 10. I mean, like
They're
that
all pretty
definitely,
good.
yeah,
Most of the ones I haven't said are just kind of boring. I think the one which doesn't seem like a zero books title is the meaningless of meaning, deconstructing linguistic signifiers, which I think is too academic to be zero books.
no, I don't think. I mean, I assume we're mostly talking about Doug era zero books, and I don't think he would have signed off on that. But but yeah, all the ones you originally read, man, it's like even the last one, which was the least, right?
Yeah.
It's like yeah, those are all pretty good. I mean again, uh, the um,
I mean, the Against Empathy and Nietzschean Critique of Contemporary Morality is clearly a book written by uh, oh fuck, McManus's evil
yeah.
twin. Okay, guys, let's knock off. I'm going to play the outro.